I knew the HOA was trouble the moment their president, Karen Whitlock, marched toward me across the dusty road with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. But even my worst expectations couldn't compare to what happened today. I inherited all 1,000 acres of Crescent Valley Ranch, land that just so happened to sit directly underneath their entire neighborhood, their streets, their clubhouse, their ornamental ponds, their kids' playground, and even the smug little dog park where they hosted weekly purebred pride parades. And as I stood at the valley overlook gripping the deed that confirmed the land was now legally mine, I thought back to the moment the lawyer handed it to me, speaking those life-changing words. Your grandfather owned everything from the East Ridge to the West Horizon. Everything the Crescent Valley HOA built on is technically yours. And the shock I felt then was nothing compared to the expression on Karen's face now. Her eyes widening like she had just witnessed a ghost crawling out of the soil, because for the first time in 10 years someone had appeared who had the authority to challenge them, to expose them, to stop them from acting like royalty ruling over peasants. And as she shouted, "You can't just show up here and claim land people live on." I calmly held up the official documents and replied, "I'm not claiming it. I already own it," watching her lips tremble in a way that told me her world had tilted off its axis, because this HOA wasn't just a group of homeowners. They were a full-blown mini-government, a petty, power-drunk empire that believed they owned the valley simply because no one had stood up to them before. And the moment I walked past Karen toward the main boulevard, I felt dozens of eyes following me, neighbors watering their plants, joggers pretending not to stare, kids peeking from behind porch railings. Everyone sensing something monumental was about to happen, something that threatened the fragile bubble of authority Karen had built around herself. And the deeper I walked into the HOA's territory, the more obvious it became that they thought they were untouchable, with signs everywhere reading absurd rules like grass must be exactly 2 inches and no unapproved vehicles allowed on community streets. Rules that suddenly felt laughable considering every inch of asphalt beneath those signs rested on my land. And when I reached the giant stone entrance arch reading Crescent Valley, a proud HOA community, I nearly laughed out loud because I recognized the stonework. It was taken from my grandfather's quarry on the north slope, meaning these people built their ego gate using resources from the very land they illegally occupied. And as a simmering anger built in my chest, I felt something my grandfather often described in his letters. The valley as a way of revealing people's true nature, and the HOA's true nature was unfolding right in front of me, loud, entitled, and panicked, because by the time Karen caught up to me again, dragging her Vice President Harold behind her like a leash-tugged poodle, she was already shouting about legal action and community bylaws. Words held as much power as a wet napkin now that I possessed the deed, and when she demanded, "You need to meet with our board immediately, we have protocols," I simply said, "The only protocol that matters is property law, and right now all of you are trespassing," which caused Harold to puff up like a startled pigeon and shout, "We pay taxes," as if that somehow made the land theirs, and I answered, "You pay taxes on your houses, not the ground under them," watching his confidence melt like butter on sun-heated asphalt. And that's when I decided to test the waters. I asked Karen straight out, "Did you know this neighborhood sits on private ranch land?" A question she avoided by pretending to smooth down her perfectly ironed blouse, while muttering something about assumptions made by developers, which already told me everything. They knew, or at least they suspected, and instead of seeking permission or researching property lines, they had bulldozed ahead and built anyway, counting on the assumption that my grandfather was gone, his heirs scattered, and the land forgotten. But they didn't expect one thing. He left everything to me, the grandson they never even knew existed. And as I looked around at their perfectly manicured lawns, I couldn't help imagining how different things would look when they realized the authority they worshiped. The HOA throne they bowed to was about to collapse because land ownership trumps their silly rules every time. And when I walked toward the clubhouse, the architectural centerpiece of their empire, I couldn't ignore the irony that it was built on the very patch of land where my grandfather used to hold cattle auctions, the soil beneath still rich with history they didn't care to understand. And as curious residents gathered around me forming a semicircle of whispers and speculation, Karen attempted to regain control by climbing onto the clubhouse steps and shouting, "Everyone remain calm. We'll sort this out. But her voice cracked a way that told me she had absolutely no plan, no leverage, no strategy, and their panic deepened as I announced loud enough for everyone to hear. I will be conducting an official land survey this week. Any structure built past the original easement lines will need to be addressed. And the gasps that followed were almost theatrical, with one man yelling, "What does address mean?" and a woman clutching her pearls whispering, "Does he mean we're getting evicted?" which sent a wave of fear rippling across the street. But I didn't answer because I wasn't ready to reveal my full strategy yet, not until I understood how deep their entitlement ran. And that's when one elderly neighbor approached me, shaking, and quietly said, "Young man, your grandfather's a good friend. Handed me a faded map of the valley, the very map my grandfather once used to mark property boundaries, riverbeds, and grazing paths. And as I unfolded it, I found something the HOA clearly didn't. No, my grandfather had drawn red circles around the area where the neighborhood now sat, and next to them he had scribbled a note. "Developers trespassing without consent. Do not let them steal the valley." That message hit me like a sledgehammer. He knew. He had seen it happening. And he had fought it quietly, legally, but when his health faded, the developers slipped in, partnered with greedy county officials, and built fast before anyone could object. And now, decades later, the responsibility to finish what he started had passed to me. Suddenly, the weight of the situation transformed into resolve. And as I walked back toward the main street, I noticed something strange. For HOA officers in their ridiculous matching polo shirts were tailing me from a distance like poorly trained mall cops, speaking into walkie-talkies as if they were handling a national crisis. And Karen barked orders into hers like, "Do not let him onto private community facilities," which was hilarious considering none of it was actually private or theirs. And when I headed toward the lake at the center of the valley, yes, even that man-made lake sat on my land. The officers tried to block my path, forming a wobbly human barrier, but I stepped right between them and kept walking, saying, "You can't stop the landowner from accessing his own property," leaving them blinking in confusion like robots short-circuiting. And that sight alone gave me enough energy to keep going as I approached the water's edge, remembering all the stories my grandfather told me about fishing here before the HOA poisoned the natural ecosystem with imported koi for aesthetics. And the sight filled me with a sadness that quickly morphed into determination. These people had disrespected the valley long enough. The wind picked up, carrying dust and tension across the shoreline, and as the HOA board began gathering behind me, whispering frantically, I said aloud to the valley itself, "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll fix this." But before I could take another step, Karen stomped forward, her voice shrill and cracking as she shouted, "You have no right to threaten our community." And I turned slowly and told her, "I'm not threatening anyone," yet letting the last word hang in the air long enough to make her flinch. And that was when I saw it. Genuine fear in her eyes. Realization. Awareness. She finally understood the truth. Her HOA kingdom was built on stolen ground, and the rightful owner had returned. But she didn't know the full plan, not yet. She didn't know the letters I discovered. She didn't know the route I had already begun with lawyers and surveyors. She didn't know the hammer that was about to drop. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the entire valley into a chill gold glow, the first sign of the coming war appeared. An envelope taped to the clubhouse door with my name on it, handwritten in shaky ink. No one claimed responsibility. No one admitted who placed it there. But the message inside would change everything. And when I opened it, my blood ran cold. I knew the second I unfolded that anonymous letter, its edges torn, its ink smudged like someone wrote it with shaking hands, that whatever was inside it wasn't just a warning but a declaration of war. And the moment my eyes landed on the first line, "You don't know what they did to your grandfather," my breath caught in my throat, because until now I had assumed the dispute between my family and the developers had been legal, financial, maybe even political. But this letter hinted at something darker, something personal, something the HOA had buried so deep they believed no one would ever dig it back up. Yet here I was holding the very shovel, and as I continued reading, each sentence twisted deeper into my spine. They forced him off the land. They threatened him. They sabotaged his irrigation lines. They sued him with fraudulent claims. They waited until he was too weak to fight before they built over everything he loved. And by the time I reached the final line, finished what he couldn't, my hands were trembling, not with fear but with anger so sharp it felt electric. And as the wind whipped the paper against my fingers, I realized someone inside the HOA, some resident trapped under Karen's iron-fisted rule, had taken a massive risk to send me this, because exposing what happened to destroy the board could unravel a decade of lies and could turn the entire valley upside down. But the letter didn't end there. When I flipped it over, there was a hand-drawn map, a crude sketch showing a hidden trail behind a lake leading to an old utility shed my grandfather once used for storing tools. And next to that shed, circled in red ink, was a single ominous word: proof. And that one word hit me harder than anything else. Because if there really was proof, documents, photos, recordings, anything, then reclaiming this land wasn't just my legal right. It was my responsibility, my duty to clear my grandfather's name and expose the HOA's crimes. But getting that proof meant navigating hostile territory, because by now word had spread across Crescent Valley that I wasn't backing down, and the residents were splitting into two groups: those who feared the HOA more than they feared eviction, and those who silently rooted for me to tear the board down brick by brick. And while the whispers grew louder behind me, I folded the letter, tucked it inside my jacket, and headed toward the lakeside trail, ignoring confused HOA officers scrambling behind me, their radio chatter filled with panicked reports like, "He's moving again. And where is he going?" As if I were an unpredictable wild animal escaping a perimeter, which honestly wasn't far from the truth, because every step I took toward that shed felt like walking toward destiny, toward a confrontation the HOA never anticipated. And as I made my way along the narrow dirt path, the sun dipping behind the hills and shadows stretching long across the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by residents peeking from behind their curtains, but by something older, deeper, like the valley itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether I would uncover its buried secrets or turn back like everyone before me. And by the time I reached the shed, its wooden frame sagging, its lock rusted, its windows clouded with dust, I felt an energy humming beneath my skin, an old, familiar sense of belonging my grandfather once described in his letters. If you ever return home, you will know it by the way the valley listens. And as I stood at the door, the air around me felt unnaturally still, like the world paused to witness what would happen next. And when I pried open the lock with a nearby crowbar, the door groaned open, revealing stacks of old crates, boxes covered in burlap, and beneath them a metal safe embedded. Into the concrete floor, its dial scratched, its paint chipped, but unmistakably deliberate, as if my grandfather had hidden it here, knowing one day someone trustworthy would find it. And I suddenly understood why the anonymous letter writer had drawn that red circle. This safe wasn't just storage. It was the truth, the heart of the conflict, the evidence of everything the HOA and corrupt developers wanted to erase. And as I knelt beside it, brushing dirt off its surface, I whispered, "What did they do to you, Grandpa?" But before I could attempt to open it, footsteps crunched on gravel behind me, fast, sharp, and unmistakably purposeful. And when I turned, 3 HOA officers stood there, Harold among them, holding flashlights like weapons, their expressions a mix of outrage and fear. And Harold puffed out his chest and barked, "This structure belongs to Crescent Valley HOA. You are trespassing." Which would have been amusing if not for the fact that their whole operation felt more like an interrogation than a simple confrontation. And I replied calmly, "This shed was built by my grandfather long before your HOA existed, and everything on this land is mine." But Harold, desperate to regain control, stepped forward and snapped, "We'll see what the sheriff says about that," even though we both knew the sheriff couldn't override property deeds. And when he reached for my arm, I pulled back sharply and warned, "Touch me again and you'll regret it," which made the other officers flinch. Not because they feared me personally, but because for the first time in their lives, someone wasn't bowing to their fabricated authority, and the fragile illusion they lived under was beginning to crack, piece by piece. But then something unexpected happened. One of the officers, the youngest of 3, nervously cleared his throat and said, "Harold, you should look at this," holding up his phone where, to everyone's shock, a news article from just an hour earlier had already begun circulating. Crescent Valley land ownership dispute, new heir emerges, and underneath it, a photo of me walking past the HOA entrance. Arch, taken by who knows who, now posted online for the entire county to see. And the look on Harold's face went from arrogance to pure dread, because he finally realized this was bigger than him, bigger than Karen, bigger than the HOA. They were losing control of the narrative, losing influence, losing the ability to bury the truth. And in that moment of distraction, I seized the opportunity, stepping back into the shed and kneeling beside the safe while the officers argued behind me. And when I ran my fingers across the dial, I noticed a faint series of scratches forming a pattern. Numbers etched into the metal in a sequence too deliberate to be random. Numbers my grandfather must have carved himself. And when I aligned them, 3197, the lock clicked, the safe groaning open like it hadn't been touched in years, and inside lay stacks of documents, cassette tapes, photographs, and a small little Ather-bound journal with my grandfather's initials burned into the cover. But before I could reach for any of it, Harold shoved past the others, saw the open safe, and yelled, "Stop. You can't take anything from there." But I ignored him and lifted the journal, dust swirling into the air as I opened it to the first page where a single haunting sentence read, "If you are reading this, they have finally come to the valley." And instantly a chill shot down my spine because this was written as if he knew, as if he anticipated everything, as if the battle I was fighting now had started long before I was even born. And as I flipped to the next pages, filled with detailed accounts of threats, vandalism, bribery attempts, and even nighttime intrusions onto our land, the officers fell silent, their faces draining of color, because this wasn't just personal diary scribbling. This was evidence, timelines, receipts, names, all meticulously recorded. And when I reached the entry dated 3 months before my grandfather's death, the truth finally hit me like a hammer to the chest. Karen Whitlock's husband visited me today. He warned that if I didn't sign over the Southern Acres, there would be consequences. I refused. 2 nights later, my barn was burned down. My jaw tightened, my pulse spiked, and I felt an anger so terrifyingly calm wash over me because this wasn't just land theft. This was intimidation, coercion, destruction. And now their daughter, this Karen, was running the HOA built on top of the empire. Her husband nearly destroyed my family to seize. And as I stared at the journal, Harold muttered, This can't be true." But his voice trembled with a guilt he couldn't hide. And before he could say anything else, headlights swept across the path outside, tires crunching on gravel, engines idling, and then Karen stepped out her SUV surrounded by a swarm of board members, her expression contorted with fury and fear as she shouted, "Get away from him. Step away from that shed now." But when she saw the open safe, her face went ghost white, like she was staring at the one thing she prayed would never resurface, and she screamed, "Close that safe. That property is HOA domain." But before I could speak, someone else emerged from the shadows, a familiar silhouette I didn't recognize at first, but when he stepped into the light, my heart lurched so violently I almost dropped the journal, because standing there, leaning shakily on a cane, was a man I thought had died years ago. And the moment he opened his mouth, everything I believed about my grandfather's final days shattered. The moment the man stepped into the flashlight beam, every voice around us fell silent. Every whisper died. Every breath hung suspended in the cold night air, because the impossible had just happened. The man everyone believed dead, the man whose land I inherited, the man whose journal lay trembling in my hands, was standing right in front of me, and when his weak, cracked voice carried across the shed entrance saying, "I knew they'd try to stop you, but I couldn't let them face you alone." My knees nearly buckled, because this wasn't some distant relative or mistaken identity. This was my grandfather, alive, older than the last time I saw him, gaunt, pale, leaning on a cane as though every step hurt, but unmistakably him. And the sight sucked the air from my lungs so violently I felt lightheaded, my brain refusing to process how he could be alive when I had attended a funeral, when I had stood over a casket, when I had listened to eulogies, when the county itself had signed a death certificate. But before I could speak, Karen gasped loudly and hissed, This isn't possible," her voice cracking like glass under pressure, and I watched the panic ripple through her board members like a shockwave because they recognized him too, every single one of them, their faces draining of color as if a vengeful ghost had crawled out of the valley floor to expose their sins. And my grandfather, with a painful exhale in trembling hands, pointed at Karen and said, "You, your husband, your developers. You didn't just take my land, you tried to erase me." And the board members began stumbling backward, some stammering excuses, others clutching their clipboards like shields, but Karen, though visibly shaken, stepped forward with that familiar arrogance she used to control her community and snapped, "This is an imposter, a stunt. You're trying to manipulate our residents." But her voice trembled at the edges, betraying her, and my grandfather gave a tired, bitter laugh and said, "You always did lie convincingly, Karen. That's how you fooled half this valley. But you didn't fool me." And then he turned his eyes toward me, and in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us as he whispered, "I'm sorry, son. I didn't die. I was forced into hiding." And before I could even form a word, he added, "They threatened to bury me in an unmarked grave next time." And that sentence hit me so hard my vision blurred with rage. My jaw locked so tightly I tasted blood, because suddenly everything made sense. The rushed funeral, the sealed casket we weren't allowed to open, the disappearance of his medical records, the lack of any real investigation, and now, standing before me, was the truth. The HOA and the developers hadn't. Just stolen land. They had tried to silence the only man who stood in their way, and now, years later, the valley had brought him back at the moment I needed him most. But Karen, still clinging desperately to power, shouted, "This is trespassing. Identity fraud. Someone call the sheriff." And her voice was so desperate it almost sounded like a cry for help instead of command, and Harold, his earlier bravado shattered, whispered, "Karen, if that's really him, we're in serious trouble." But Karen whirled on it with a fury I'd never seen and screeched, "Shut up. Everything falls apart if we let this charade continue," revealing more truth in her panic than any confession ever could. And my grandfather, steadying himself on his cane, said, "Tell them, Karen. Tell them why you hid my body. Tell them what your husband did." And Karen's face contorted with such raw fear that even her most loyal board members took a step away from her, as though guilt were infectious. And then my grandfather collapsed forward slightly, coughing, and I rushed to catch him, feeling his frail frame shaking under my hands. And when he looked up at me, eyes filled with years of suffering, he whispered, "The proof, everything you need, it's in the tapes," and gestured weakly toward the safe, and instantly I understood. This wasn't just documentation. It was evidence so damning it could destroy the entire Crescent Valley HOA, could expose corruption reaching into developer groups and county officials, could overturn every deed they issued, could send people to prison. And that's when Karen lunged forward as if she could physically stop the truth, screaming, and oh, one touches those tapes. But she was too slow, because I was already holding them. 5 cassette tapes labeled with dates and names I recognized from the journal. And as I lifted them into the air, the headlights behind us suddenly multiplied, doubling, then tripling, until the path was washed in white light, engines rumbling like a stampede. And for a split second, I thought the sheriff had arrived, that justice was finally here. But when the doors opened and silhouettes poured out, my stomach dropped. These weren't police, weren't neighbors, weren't reporters. These were private security, big men in black uniforms with earpieces, the kind hired by corporations when they want to scare silence into people. And Karen exhaled in relief, smiling a twisted, triumphant smile as she shouted, "Finally, remove them from property at once." And the guard at the front stepped forward and said, "We have authorization to secure all Crescent Valley assets." But I stepped between them and my grandfather and shouted, "This isn't Crescent Valley property. This is MY land." But the guard smirked and pulled a document from his jacket, waving it condescendingly and saying, "Per emergency HOA Directive 14D, we have jurisdiction to secure any structure deemed a threat to community stability." And the rage that exploded inside my chest was so intense I thought I'd lose control, because these guards weren't here for safety. They were here to seize the safe, the evidence, the tapes, and maybe my grandfather. But before I could react, before I could fight, before I could speak, my grandfather squeezed my arm with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't fight them here. Take the valley back strategically, legally, the way I taught you." And though every muscle in my body screamed to swing at the guards, I forced myself still. But the guards didn't wait. They pushed past the HOA officers, shoved Karen aside like she was nothing more than a nuisance, and stormed into shed, 2 of them, grabbing boxes. Another tried to lift the safe itself, but as they bent down, one guard shouted, "It's bolted. Get the tools." And in that moment, the night erupted into chaos. Residents began pouring down the trail, drawn by the commotion. Phones up recording everything. Board members begging the guards to stop. Children crying. Elderly neighbors shouting that the HOA had gone too far. And Karen screaming over everyone, "Stop recording. This is private HOA business," which only made more people record. And then through the noise, my grandfather tapped my hand and whispered, "They can take the shed, but they can't take the land," and lifted his head with a grim smile. "But we're not letting them walk away with the evidence. And before I could ask how, he pointed at the safe and mouthed a single word: backup. My heart skipped a beat. Backup? Where? How? But then I remembered the journal entries, the map, the symbols. My grandfather always made second copies of everything, always had duplicates, always prepared for war. And suddenly the chaos around me sharpened into clarity. The guards were stealing the wrong thing, because the real evidence, the damning final evidence, was somewhere else entirely, somewhere only I could find, if I could get my grandfather away from the guards before they realized it. But as I helped him stand, Karen noticed, her eyes narrowing like a predator catching movement in the bushes, and she pointed at us and screamed, "Stop them! They're trying to flee with stolen materials." And the guards immediately shifted direction, storming toward me and my grandfather, their heavy boots pounding the dirt, and the residents gasped, some shouting for them to stop, others too afraid to intervene. And I pulled my grandfather close, preparing to run despite his weakened state. But just as the guards closed in, just as their hands reached out, just as my pulse hammered in my ears like a war drum, a deafening horn blast shook the entire valley. So loud the guards froze, the residents screamed, birds scattered from the trees. And then headlights brighter than anything before flooded the trail from the opposite direction, engines roaring like thunder, metal clanking. And when the machines rolled into view, every single person stopped breathing, because barreling down the path were county land survey trucks, environmental protection vans, and 3 official vehicles marked with the state seal, all screeching to a halt in front of us. Doors slamming open, boots stomping, and a stern voice calling out, "Everyone step away from the landowner immediately. This area is now under official state investigation." And as the guards backed up in confusion, Karen's face twisted into horror, and the residents burst into whispers. A woman in a government windbreaker walked toward me, flipped open a badge, and said the words that made Karen nearly collapse. "We received an anonymous report that Crescent Valley HOA has been illegally occupying protected ranch land for over a decade, and we have reason to believe evidence tampering is occurring right now." And then she turned her gaze toward the safe, toward the guards, and finally toward me, before adding, "Mr. Flynn, we need your cooperation. We believe your grandfather left more evidence hidden in this valley, evidence your HOA has been trying to destroy. We'll protect you both, but we need to know where the backup is." But before I could answer, before I could even inhale, my grandfather whispered a single sentence that froze the blood in my veins. "Tell her nothing, because someone in this investigation is working for Karen." And when I looked up at the government agents' faces, suddenly I realized I didn't know who to trust anymore. I knew the HOA would break eventually, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the chaos that exploded the moment I stepped onto the stage at the emergency town hall meeting they had arranged in pure panic, because the hook was simple and devastating. Tonight, your HOA finally learns what happens when entitled people build an entire community on land they never owned. The room was packed, people shoulder to shoulder, faces red, eyes frantic, whispering, shouting, demanding answers. And for the first time since I inherited those 1,000 acres, I felt the weight of every lie, every fake document, every bullying tactic they had used for years to intimidate homeowners and silence anyone who dared challenge them. The atmosphere was electric, vicious, almost feral, and Karen, the HOA president whose entire personality was built on controlling people, looked ready to combust as she slammed her gavel and shrieked at me that I had no right to interfere with her neighborhood. I didn't bother responding, because the projector behind me lit up with the final bombshell. The complete legal chain of ownership, county verified, dated decades before the HOA even existed, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that I owned every inch of the land beneath their homes, their clubhouse, their pool, their pickleball courts, their gardens, their sidewalks, their fences, even the lakefront where they held their annual barbecue competitions. The room erupted, gasps, curses, stunned silence, followed by homeowners turning on the HOA board, shouting that they'd been lied to, scammed, extorted with bogus fees on land the board never had the right to manage. Karen pounded her gavel so hard it snapped in half, but the moment she opened her mouth to accuse me of fraud, my attorney calmly slid forward the final document, a court-approved transfer of land usage rights, signed 2 hours earlier by a judge, granting me full authority to renegotiate every lease, every access right, every structural agreement, which meant the HOA was no longer the governing authority over anything Not the roads, not the amenities, not the shared buildings, not even the lawns they claim to protect. Karen went pale, genuinely pale, as the audience roared so loudly the windows shook. Then came the twist I'd been saving. I announced that beginning next week, every homeowner would receive a brand new, fair, crystal clear land use contract at zero cost, eliminating 80% of the insane fees the HOA had been charging, trash penalties, grassling fines, mailbox color citations, porch share inspections. And the entire room exploded with cheers so loud Karen's jaw clenched like she was about to faint. But then I dropped a sentence that silenced everyone instantly. However, some structures sitting on my land were illegally built, including expansion sheds, fences, pools, and certain luxury add-ons constructed without any county permit, and those will require mandatory review. The silence shifted into a shocked buzz as people realized many of them had followed HOA orders to build things that were never legal to begin with. And then Karen lost it, absolutely lost it, charging toward the front, screaming that I couldn't do that I couldn't take away her power, her authority, her ability to run the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. But right before security reached her, I played the final video on the projector, drone footage of Karen's own backyard, where she had built a massive illegal pavilion, hot tub, extended deck, and even a private boat dock into the community lake, all funded by HOA money she had been siphoning under maintenance costs. The room didn't just erupt. It exploded into fury. People surged forward, shouting that she'd been stealing from them, threatening lawsuits, demanding refunds, demanding her arrest. Karen tried to run, literally tried to bolt out of the emergency exit, but deputies waiting outside stopped her, and as they escorted her out, she screamed that I had ruined everything, that this community belonged to her, that she built this place, and the sheriff simply said, "Ma'am, you didn't build anything. You trespassed on someone else's land for years." With the board collapsing, homeowners turned to me, some begging for help, some apologizing, some still in disbelief that the land they lived on was never theirs to begin with. And I didn't want to punish innocent people. My fight was never with the residents, but with the corrupt HOA that had abused them for years. So I made an announcement that stunned all of them. I would dissolve the HOA permanently, convert the entire neighborhood into a lease-friendly private township under my management, slash all fees to minimal maintenance charges, hire a full professional team to oversee property issues fairly, and give every resident 3 options. Sign the new agreement. Purchase the land beneath their home outright at a discounted rate, or relocate with compensation if they didn't want to stay. They couldn't believe it. Some cried, some hugged each other, some rushed to shake my hand, and the energy shifted from chaos to relief, hope, and an overwhelming sense that after years of HOA tyranny, they were finally free. But just as the room settled, a messenger rushed in with a folder addressed to me, handed by the county development office, and the contents made my stomach drop. A newly uncovered document showing that the HOA had been planning a massive expansion. 200 more houses, luxury community centers, private rentals, using my land as collateral behind my back. The plans were weeks from being finalized, and the developers involved were powerful, wealthy, and definitely not the type to walk away quietly. As I stared at the blueprints, realizing that this battle was far from over, the lights in the halls suddenly flickered, the projector glitched, and every phone in the room buzzed with the same notification. Urgent county alert. Large development corporation files emergency injunction against landowner. The crowd froze. My attorney leaned toward me and whispered, This is war." And as the room erupted all over again, I realized the HOA was only the beginning, because the people coming after my land next were bigger, richer, and far more dangerous, and they absolutely were not going to let 1,000 acres slip out of their hands without a fight. The cliffhanger wasn't just real, it was massive. The entitled HOA had fallen, but a corporate giant had just stepped onto the battlefield, and they had no idea who they were dealing with.